One of the most profound and persistent questions within biblical studies, and undoubtedly one that has sparked curiosity across generations, revolves around the fate of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Where have they gone? And will they ever return?
Did they truly vanish from history, as many claim? Or are they simply hidden beneath complex layers of time, political decisions, conflicts, diasporas, and migratory movements that reshaped the ancient world?
They took everything, even our name.
Lost?
No.
Scattered, so that all nations could be found.
This question not only echoes among scholars, but also crosses cultures, traditions, and even modern beliefs, keeping alive one of the greatest mysteries in the biblical narrative. In this documentary, we invite you not just to watch, but to walk with us to the very end of this investigative journey. Here, we go far beyond superficial theories. We will explore in depth the hypotheses surrounding the so-called lost tribes, analyzing historical records, cross-referencing biblical texts, and examining clues that, over the centuries, have been left behind as silent marks of this story. Every piece of evidence, every fragment of a narrative, every cultural connection may represent an important part of a puzzle that has not yet been fully assembled. And the further we go, the more we realize that this mystery may be more complex and more fascinating than it first appears. So join us on this compelling journey, where history, faith, and investigation meet. Along the way, you will be led to reflect not only on the past, but also on how these narratives may have influenced peoples, identities, and even entire civilizations. If this topic interests you, consider sharing this content with friends and family who also appreciate historical and spiritual questions, as this is a discussion worth expanding. After all, the question remains alive. Where are the 12 tribes of Israel? Did they truly disappear? Or were they simply transformed throughout history? To begin understanding this question in a solid way, it is necessary to return to the origins, to the point where everything began to take shape. After the liberation of the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt, one of the most significant events in the biblical narrative, the Israelites began a long journey toward the land of Canaan, the promise made by God to Abraham and reaffirmed to his descendants. However, this journey was not only physical, it was also spiritual, marked by challenges, tests, and choices that would shape the destiny of an entire nation. Even in the face of miracles, provision, and divine guidance, the people repeatedly drifted away from the laws, instructions, and commandments that had been given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. This departure was not isolated or occasional. It was a recurring pattern, revealing a constant tension between faithfulness and disobedience. And inevitably, this brought deep consequences. The Bible clearly shows that the covenant established between God and Israel was not merely symbolic, but conditional in terms of human response. Faithfulness to this covenant was essential for the people to remain under protection, guidance, and prosperity. In the book of Leviticus, this dynamic is presented in a direct and almost solemn way. Blessings are promised for obedience, while severe warnings are directed toward rebellion. Every choice made by the nation would have a real, concrete, and visible impact on its historical trajectory. This covenant required exclusivity. Israel was not only to acknowledge God, but to completely reject any form of idolatry, avoiding the assimilation of pagan practices from surrounding nations. It was a call to a distinct identity, set apart, shaped not only by rituals, but by a way of life that reflected this relationship with the divine. It was not simply about religious rules, but about a covenant that defined who that people were and who they were meant to remain, even amid external influences. In Leviticus 26:1-17, this warning takes on an even more direct and striking tone. I will set my face against you, and you shall be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you shall reign over you, and you shall flee when no one pursues you. This passage reveals something profound. Breaking the covenant would not result only in spiritual consequences, but also historical and political ones. Divine protection would be withdrawn, opening the door to invasions, defeats, and foreign domination. The tribes, once united under a common identity, could be scattered among the nations, fragmented, assimilated, and gradually losing their original distinction. This cycle, disobedience, judgment, and restoration, runs throughout Israel's narrative as a recurring pattern, almost like a constant warning across generations. It reveals that the relationship with God was not merely a matter of individual faith, but the very foundation upon which the entire structure of the nation was built. When that foundation was shaken, everything around it began to collapse as well. In verse 25, this reality is expressed in an even more intense and detailed way. I will bring against you hostile nations, and they will draw the sword to avenge the covenant. And when you retreat into your cities, I will send a plague among you, and you will be delivered into the hands of the enemy. Here we see not just an announcement of punishment, but the description of a rupture, the removal of something that had once sustained the people. Divine protection, which had guided Israel since its formation, now gave way to vulnerability, conflict, and loss. Over time, the tribes of Israel drifted further and further from the one who had formed them as a nation. Idolatry became common, and pagan customs were gradually absorbed, almost imperceptibly, until they became part of everyday life. This cultural and spiritual mixture weakened the identity of the people, making them more susceptible to external influences and surrounding threats. As a direct consequence of this process, God allowed neighboring nations to rise against Israel. Invasions began to occur, territories were taken, and political and military control passed into foreign hands. This marked the beginning of a long and turbulent period, characterized by instability, subjugation, and eventually dispersion, a scenario that would set the stage for one of the greatest mysteries in biblical history, the ultimate fate of these tribes. The historical narrative itself reinforces this process of decline in a striking way, as if each generation left behind a clear trace of progressive distancing. In the prophetic records, especially in the words of the book of Hosea, we see a direct portrayal of this critical moment. In Hosea 8:4, Israel's leaders are described as rulers established without divine approval, men who assumed power not through God's direction, but through human interests, political alliances, and personal ambition. This detail is not minor. It reveals a profound rupture, where even the leadership of the nation no longer reflected the original purpose established in the covenant. When the tribes abandoned this covenant and turned to other gods, adopting idolatrous practices and foreign customs, the result was inevitable. Israel ceased to be a protected nation and became vulnerable, surrounded by peoples competing for territory, influence, and control. What had once been a strong and distinct identity began to fragment, and the people who had been set apart for a specific purpose came to live as vassals among the nations, subject to external forces and constant instability. This period of decline was not merely political or military, it deeply affected the very essence of the nation. It was in this context that the 12 tribes began to lose their cohesion, culminating in processes of exile, dispersion, and assimilation. And it is precisely from this point that numerous theories emerged over the centuries, attempting to explain the ultimate fate of these tribes. The historical silence that follows regarding some of them opened the door to speculation that has spanned generations, blending tradition, faith, and efforts at historical reconstruction. Among these theories, some suggest that the tribes were completely assimilated into other cultures, losing their original identity over time. Others argue that they preserved their heritage in hidden ways, surviving in distant regions under new cultural forms. This apparent disappearance remains one of the most debated topics in theology and history, raising a central question: how does God's covenant with Israel manifest itself over time, even in the face of dispersion? One of the most curious and also most controversial hypotheses that has emerged over the centuries is the idea that the Israelites became ancestors of indigenous tribes in the Americas. Although fascinating at first glance and widely circulated in certain contexts, this theory faces serious challenges when examined through historical, biblical, and scientific scrutiny. With the advancement of modern studies, especially in the fields of genetics, archaeology, and linguistics, it has become possible to investigate the origins of populations with far greater precision, and the data consistently points to a different reality. The indigenous peoples of the Americas have predominantly Asian origins, with strong connections to populations from the Far East, Siberia, and other regions of Asia. These conclusions are not based on a single piece of evidence, but on a broad set of analyses, including DNA studies, migration patterns, and cultural development over thousands of years. In addition, when we observe physical and cultural aspects, the differences become even more evident. Indigenous peoples of the Americas display characteristics that connect them directly to Asian groups, such as Chinese, Japanese, Mongolians, and Siberians. Their physical traits, such as almond-shaped eyes and straight dark hair, as well as their cultural and social patterns, follow a trajectory completely distinct from that of ancient Middle Eastern populations. From a historical and technological perspective, these differences are also significant. While the ancient Israelites lived in a Bronze Age context and developed practices such as metal use, advanced tools, and structured writing systems, indigenous peoples of the Americas followed their own paths, with distinct technologies, cultural expressions, and forms of social organization. This is not a matter of superiority or inferiority, but of entirely independent historical trajectories. Clothing, for example, clearly reflects this difference. The Israelites used woven fabrics, often dyed, with specific symbolism tied to their religious and cultural traditions. In contrast, indigenous peoples of the Americas developed unique expressions such as body painting, feather adornments, the use of natural elements, and, in many cases, less reliance on elaborately woven textiles. These distinctions are not merely visual, they represent entirely different cultural worlds shaped by their own contexts and histories. Another relevant point lies in typical physical characteristics. Ancient Semitic peoples, such as the Israelites, generally exhibited features associated with the Middle East, including greater amounts of body hair and region-specific facial traits. These characteristics are rarely observed among indigenous American populations, further reinforcing the absence of a direct connection between these groups. With the advancement of modern genetic analysis, many of these older theories have been objectively tested and largely refuted. The results show that indigenous peoples of the Americas have a much stronger genetic affinity with Asian populations than with any group from the Middle East. This evidence is consistent and widely accepted within the scientific community. Even in cases where there are variations in skin tone among indigenous groups, these differences are explained by ancient population mixing and environmental adaptations over time, without indicating any direct link to Semitic lineages. In some interpretative contexts, these origins are associated with ancestries connected to ancient Asian peoples, often linked in biblical traditions to lineages such as Togarma, rather than to the tribes of Israel. If there were a significant genetic relationship between indigenous peoples of the Americas and ancient Israelites, modern Jews, or other Semitic populations from the Middle East, such a connection would already have been clearly identified. However, the data shows the exact opposite. There is no relevant genetic evidence supporting this hypothesis. In contrast, populations from the Middle East, such as Arabs, Syrians, and Lebanese, demonstrate consistent genetic proximity to Jewish populations, indicating a shared regional origin. In light of this, it becomes evident that the indigenous peoples of the Americas cannot be classified as descendants of the so-called lost tribes of Israel. This conclusion does not diminish the value of these cultures. On the contrary, it reinforces the importance of understanding each people within its own history, respecting their true origins and unique trajectories. At the same time, this analysis highlights the fundamental role of scientific advances in revisiting ancient narratives. Many ideas that emerged in periods of limited knowledge were carried forward through time. But today, they can be re-evaluated based on more solid evidence. This does not weaken faith or tradition. On the contrary, it allows for a deeper, more balanced, and well-founded understanding of human history. And so, as we set aside certain hypotheses, we move closer to the central question that still remains open. If they are not in the Americas, then where, after all, are the lost tribes of Israel? One theory that has gained traction in recent decades, especially with the expansion of social media and digital content, suggests that certain African peoples are direct descendants of the so-called lost tribes of Israel. At first glance, this idea may seem convincing to some, as it follows a logic similar to other popular hypotheses, such as the association between Israelites and indigenous peoples of the Americas. In essence, it represents a modern attempt to reinterpret the biblical narrative through the lens of new cultural identities. However, when examined more closely, this theory begins to reveal significant inconsistencies. The first point of tension arises when we compare this hypothesis with Judaism itself, both in its contemporary form and in its older traditions. Over centuries, Jewish communities have preserved records, genealogies, and interpretations that do not support this broad association with African populations. In fact, ancient texts and traditions recorded more than 1,000 years ago already presented a structured understanding of the origins of nations based on post-flood genealogies. Among these sources, the writings of Flavius Josephus stand out, offering one of the most detailed accounts of the dispersion of peoples after the flood. According to Josephus, African populations largely descend from Ham, one of Noah's sons, through his descendants Cush, Mizraim, and Put. These lineages are traditionally associated with the formation of various African populations, particularly in the northern and northeastern regions of the continent. Despite this, some modern theorists argue that these same groups are, in fact, descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. However, this interpretation does not find consistent support in the scriptures, in ancient Jewish traditions, or in contemporary scientific studies. When we examine genetic data, for example, there is no significant similarity between African populations in general and Semitic peoples of the Middle East, such as Jews and Arabs. This reinforces the understanding that African ancestry is predominantly Hamitic rather than Semitic. Another argument often raised by proponents of this theory involves the existence of African groups that claim Jewish descent. At this point, it is important to make a careful distinction. The most widely recognized example is that of the Ethiopian Jews, historically known as Beta Israel. This group does, in fact, preserve ancient Jewish traditions and is recognized as having a connection to Judaism. However, even in this case, their identity is often described as Judeo-Cushitic, as their genetic background is strongly linked to the lineage of Cush. This historical connection places them close to various peoples of the Horn of Africa, such as Ethiopians, Eritreans, and Somalis. Biblically, Cush is associated with the ancient kingdom of Cush, a powerful civilization located in the region of Nubia, corresponding largely to modern-day Sudan. This demonstrates that even when Jewish elements are present, they do not necessarily indicate direct descent from the lost tribes, but rather historical interactions, conversions, or specific cultural developments. When we broaden the analysis to other regions of the world, we see that biblical traditions also associate different peoples with other lineages. For example, many Asian populations, and in some traditional interpretations, indigenous peoples, are linked to Togarma, connected to the lineage of Japheth. Meanwhile, African populations remain largely associated with Ham and his descendants, such as Mizraim, often linked to ancient Egypt, Cush, and Put. This genealogical framework, although ancient, presents an internal coherence that aligns both with historical traditions and with certain patterns observed in modern studies. In addition to these hypotheses involving Africa and Asia, theories have also emerged attempting to locate the tribes of Israel within European territory. One of the most well-known is the idea that the ancient Israelites gave rise to the British peoples, or the Anglo-Saxons. This theory gained traction during certain historical periods, especially within specific ideological contexts, but lacks solid academic support. Much of these interpretations rely on misreadings of biblical texts, often distorting the original meaning of words. A classic example involves the description of King David as ruddy. In the original Hebrew, the term does not necessarily refer to hair color, but rather to a reddish or sun-bronzed complexion, something common among Middle Eastern populations. This linguistic nuance is crucial, as it undermines attempts to associate David, and by extension the people of Israel, with physical traits typically linked to European populations, such as blonde or red hair. In light of this, the European theory also loses credibility, both from historical, linguistic, and genetic perspectives. The ethnic, cultural, and historical characteristics of European peoples follow a trajectory distinct from that of the ancient Israelites. Thus, when we analyze these different hypotheses, whether involving indigenous peoples, Africans, or Europeans, we begin to notice a common pattern. All of them attempt to fill the void left by the historical disappearance of part of the tribes of Israel. However, these modern constructions, while intriguing, do not withstand a more rigorous analysis grounded in evidence. The idea that indigenous or African peoples could be classified as lost tribes of Israel becomes even more fragile when we consider the chronology of ancient civilizations. Peoples such as the Maya, Aztecs, and Incas had already developed complex cultures, organized social systems, and distinct identities long before any possible contact with Israelite tribes. Likewise, African civilizations are among the oldest in human history, established for millennia as descendants of lineages associated with Cush, Mizraim, and Put, long before the emergence of the Hebrew people as a nation. This analysis reinforces an important conclusion. Although the existence of the lost tribes of Israel is a widely recognized historical reality, attempts to identify them among various peoples around the world often reflect more a human desire for connection than actual evidence. And as we set aside these hypotheses, we move closer to the central question that continues to echo through time: where, in fact, are these tribes? In light of all this, an unavoidable question arises, one that is almost impossible to ignore. Where are the lost tribes mentioned throughout history? The answer begins to take shape when we return to one of the most decisive events in Israel's history. In 722 BC, the northern kingdom reached its breaking point. The city of Samaria was conquered, and the powerful Assyrian Empire carried out a policy that would forever change the destiny of these tribes. This historical detail is crucial because it moves us out of the realm of speculation and into a concrete scenario. The tribes did not mysteriously or suddenly disappear. They were deported. Taken into Assyrian territory within a highly tense political context marked by direct conflicts with Egypt, this moment reshapes how we understand their fate. This point is essential, as it challenges many popular theories. Considering that Assyria was in conflict with Egypt during that period, any movement toward the African continent would have been practically impossible. The only viable route would have passed directly through Egyptian territory, which, under those military conditions, would have been unfeasible. As a result, the Assyrians kept the Israelites within their own controlled regions, preventing any significant migration toward the south. But is there clear biblical support for this claim? The answer is yes, and it is direct. The scriptures themselves leave no room for ambiguity. In the book of 2 Kings 17:6, we find a precise record of this moment. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria, placing them in Hala, by the Habor River in Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. This description is neither symbolic nor metaphorical. It presents specific locations, real regions that can be geographically identified within the ancient Near East. This means that the fate of the tribes of the northern kingdom is not shrouded in complete mystery. It was documented. They were taken to areas that today correspond largely to regions of modern-day Iraq, Syria, and surrounding territories. Over the centuries, however, something equally significant occurred. These people did not remain isolated. Gradually, they began to intermingle with local populations, Assyrians, Syrians, and other groups already living in those regions. This process of assimilation did not happen all at once, but unfolded across generations. Meanwhile, that same territory underwent constant transformation, falling under successive empires: Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Parthians, Turks, and later Arabs during the expansion of Islam. Each wave of conquest added a new cultural, political, and genetic layer, making it increasingly difficult to trace a distinct tribal identity. Faced with this, one might ask, is this understanding limited only to the Old Testament? The answer is no. The New Testament itself provides important indications of continuity. It reveals that not all tribes simply vanished; some were still recognized centuries later. A striking example appears in the Gospel of Luke, where Anna, a prophetess from the tribe of Asher, is mentioned. Another significant case is Paul the Apostle, who explicitly declares his origin from the tribe of Benjamin. These records show that, although there was dispersion and assimilation, Israelite identity was not completely erased from history. This leads us to an important conclusion. The tribes were not entirely lost. They were, to a large extent, absorbed. They remained predominantly in the Middle East, endured conquests, cultural changes, and, in many cases, a spiritual distancing that had already been warned of by the prophets. But then a deeper question emerges, one that is not only historical, but spiritual. What, ultimately, was the destiny of these tribes within God's plan? The scriptures point to an answer that goes beyond geography or genetics. With the coming of Jesus Christ, there is a radical transformation in the understanding of what it means to be the people of God. The promise is no longer confined to an ethnic or national identity. A new concept emerges: a spiritual Israel. As taught by the Apostle Paul the Apostle, in Christ there is no longer a distinction between Jew and Gentile. Identity is no longer defined by blood, but by faith. This means that God's purpose was not frustrated by the dispersion of the tribes. On the contrary, it was expanded. In this context, the assimilation of Israelites among the peoples of Assyria, Syria, and other regions is not seen merely as a historical consequence, but as part of a greater plan, a plan in which, over time, people from all nations would have access to the promise. And according to this perspective, many of these descendants, even if they no longer fully recognize their origins, are part of this process, and in due time may come to recognize their spiritual heritage. Thus, what once seemed like loss reveals itself as transformation. What once seemed like disappearance reveals itself as expansion. And the final answer shifts from "where are the tribes?" to something far deeper. They did not vanish as many imagine. They were scattered, mixed, and, in a sense, woven into something greater than a single nation. Because in the end, the promise is not limited to one people. It extends to all humanity, to all who believe, to all who turn toward God. May God bless you, and I'll see you soon.